Hi everyone. Here we are at our next lecture, and this one is going to focus on life in both Europe and the United States during the 1920s. And it was definitely a time when it was much better to be in the United States than in Europe. Okay, I'm going to give you a list of terms, and like in the other lectures, I expect you to write two one-paragraph analyses of the terms, placing them within the context of the overall lesson. I also want you to do a one paragraph response to something written by one of your classmates. Okay, so our terms are going to be speakeasies, Great Depression dash Great Slump, President Herbert Hoover, Hoovervilles, Hoovervilles, Hoover flags, German recession of 1923, and Bauhaus, Bauhaus. Okay, so to continue about life in the 20s. Okay, first of all, in Europe, things were really going very bad. Okay, one of the best looks of what life was like in the 1920s is kind of portrayed in the famous musical Cabaret. So Cabaret shows how things are getting worse and worse during the 1920s in Germany. Remember, in Germany, we see the rise of totalitarianism. So, a later lecture, we're going to talk about the rise of Hitler. But what we're focusing on today is going to be some of the things leading into the rise of Hitler. Okay, first of all, remember Keynes is talking about this idea that people can't. Um, he's talking about this idea that it was very unfair to inflict this ridiculous penalty on Germany after World War One, and then uh, basically he didn't like the fact that the Germans were being boxed in, and that people were being boxed in and no chance to ever get out economically would resort to desperate and dangerous things. And boy, was he right, as we see. Okay, so here's kind of what's happening in Germany. Germany, the economic climate gets worse and worse. By the end of 1923 and into 1924, there's going to be what's called our first term, German recession of 1923. Things became so bad during the German recession of 1923 that it took a wheelbarrow full of German money to pay for a loaf of bread. So people would basically bring their money in a wheelbarrow, and they would care a whole lot more that somebody would steal the wheelbarrow than they would the currency in it. So it's basically saying the currency was worth nothing. It would be almost like, let's say you buy an alligator wallet for $400, about the right price for, genuine alligator. And, after spending all that money, all you have is $10 left. So what are you going to care about more? That somebody would steal your wallet or they would steal the $10? Okay, so basically the value of the currency became worthless during the German recession of 23 and 24. Now, those who were paid a salary, basically what happened was they were paid during their lunch break, and they would spend their money before the price of goods would go up at the end of the day. So they would keep up. So let's say a loaf of bread was 1,000 Deutschmarks on Wednesday, and then 1,200 Deutschmarks on Thursday. Well, as long as you had the 1,000 Wednesday, you were fine. So the next day you would get the 1,200. So the ones who were really hurt were those who had money in savings and or in pensions. So think what that's like. Let's say you have a very generous pension of $8,000 a month, okay, or 96,000 a year. It'd be an unbelievably generous pension. But that's assuming prices are like what they are now. What if a gallon of gas suddenly becomes $45? A loaf of bread becomes $30. Would your 8,000 a month become worth anything then? No, wouldn't be able to keep up with the inflation. So those working were able to keep up. Those who lived off of investments or those who had pensions, which don't rise, they were the ones who were really, in bad shape. And we're going to see once the German economy reaches Depression era levels, and that's not going to be until 1932, 1 year before Hitler comes to power. That's when things really get bad. So this was a temporary time when the German economy was really bad, but because of those penalties inflicted upon Germany, there was really nothing they could do to make things any better. And the Germans really didn't understand the whole thing, why the whole society hated them. They felt they did bad things, but so did everyone else. And they also, the Germans they really couldn't understand why they even lost the war. The Germans were by far the hardest working people in Europe. They were the most literate. They were the most scientifically advanced. So all these things should have made them, vastly superior to almost everybody else in Europe, yet they lost the war and then had the blame placed upon them. Okay, so anyway, we see that the Great Depression of German recession of 1923, and just like as we're going to see in America, recession's not as bad as the Depression. All right, now because of the recession in Germany, and actually even a little bit before this German recession of 23, right after the war, there's going to be a movement in architecture in Germany referred to as, this is another term, Bauhaus. Okay, Bauhaus is spelled Bauhaus. All right, and what the Bauhaus, their credo, their saying associated with the Bauhaus was the idea of function before form. Now they were moving against the architectural movements before the war. The movements before the war were all about being as grand and elegant as possible. Buildings before the war, like let's say a bank, you would try to make it look as luxurious and extravagant as possible, because that would show that they were solvent, and then people would trust them to hold their money. If you look too much like you were, a Quaker church or a Baptist church or just something really simple, it would just look like you were poor and couldn't afford, to pay back interest. So they would look as extravagant as possible. Now, with the Bauhaus, right after the war, they're going to switch from this aesthetic look prior to the war to the Bauhaus movement with its saying of function before form, because when the whole society needed to be rebuilt, it was largely destroyed in the war. That's not going to be the time when you worry about appearance. Appearance and art and fine craftsmanship and beautiful architecture are fantastic things, but not when you have people without homes. You're just trying to build homes quickly and simply. So that would be the movement that comes about after World War I. So the Bauhaus movement in Germany, starting really as early as 1919, and it made perfect sense. It'd be like, as students there at the college, would you want your classrooms to look very over the top, extravagant, or do you want them very simple? Well, me as the professor teaching there, I would like it very, elegant and luxurious. But you as the students there, you're going to want it to be pretty simple because you're the ones who have to pay for it. Do you really want them to give a $500 surcharge to pay for a luxurious building? Okay. Now, in Germany, after World War I, there's also going to be what they call this is another term, the Weimar Republic. Weimar Republic. Okay, the Weimar Republic went from 1919, right after the war, until 1933. 33 is when Hitler comes to power. Okay, so what stood out about the Weimar Republic? Well, the Weimar Republic was known for its political instability. It went from the far right politically to the far left virtually every year or two. So the fact that it oscillated that extreme, what's this telling us? This telling us that the people did not have any confidence in the governments that they had. So they went, one direction and then suddenly said, this is horrible, we're going to go completely the opposite. Well, it takes a leader a while to learn his job and then to implement policy and test policy. If it's constantly changing, there's going to be no stability, and people had no trust of the Weimar government. So it's kind of going from, one extreme to the other, and that's going to be what stands out about the Weimar Republic. Okay, in America, things were going very well. We talked about this a bit last time in our lecture. We were talking about life in the Jazz Age. Okay, so the people of the 1920s in America were all about celebration. One of the celebrations is going to lead eventually into prohibition. Okay, so there's going to be the passing of prohibition, the prohibiting the production and distribution of alcohol. So now, what's going to lead to that? Well, there's really what's going to lead to it is people were acting crazy and over the top and basically drunk in the streets all the time. Because of the great economy in America after World War I, and it was really the only place where we really see this great economy, kind of the polar opposite of the deprivation and starvation happening in Europe. The American stock market was, going very, very well. You could basically bet on almost anything, and there was like a 75 to 80% chance that it would go up in value. People felt a great deal of confidence. They felt that poverty was something that was of the past. It was done away with. Everyone could live well. So their biggest problem was that they want their cashmere from China or Scotland. Well, not quite like that, but it was just this idea that everyone's living very extravagantly. So, as part of that extravagance and all this money being made, people are celebrating. Now, the thing with alcohol is it can be, something to celebrate something, think of like a champagne toast, but it can also be in times of sorrow and misery, a way to drown out the pain of everyday life. Okay, so all this happening in the, particularly the early 20s, and this is going to lead to prohibition. Now, two groups that were very much behind the passing of prohibition in America, and they put a lot of pressure on the American government. One group was called the Anti-Saloon League, and another group was called the Christian Women's Temperance Movement. Now, both of those groups, they basically saw alcohol as against women, and, to some extent it was, because, men were traditionally the heavy drinkers. Men would go to bars for lunch. They would get a liquid lunch, and, often if you bought the beer, you would get like a free sandwich. And, what would happen? They would come home drunk and then beat their wives and children. So it's very much something that would concern women and affect their lives. So eventually the government passed prohibition. But as we know, just because something is against the law does not necessarily mean it becomes eradicated. And that's what we see in the 1920s. So there in the 20s, there's going to be what are called these underground clubs called, next term, speakeasies. Okay, a speakeasy is an underground club, and what they played there at the speakeasies were what they're calling torch songs. A torch song, think of what it means when you hold a torch for someone. You desire them, you want them. Well, a torch song would be these kind of sad, lonely, longing love ballads that almost based on kind of a yearning or an unrequited love. Okay, what kind of settings were the speakeasies? Well, um, we were fortunate enough. They had one of our historical meetings a few years back in Chicago, and they had it in actually an authentic speakeasy. Now the speakeasy was it was the bottom of a kind of a fancy hotel. It had walls that were painted kind of a maroon color. It had couches around the room, and it had a door with a sliding uh, almost like a sliding glass thing. You would knock on there, the person would pull across the glass. They would say, "What's the password?" And it would be something, really clever, like "John sent me." And then you would know, wait a minute, this person is meant to be here at the speakeasy, he was invited by John, or he knows the password. And then you would be there in the speakeasies. Now, there in the speakeasies, there was always a police officer. He would keep order there. So make sure you didn't get too drunk and too wild. And here's what's kind of interesting. Okay, the drink of the time was actually Canadian whiskey. Now that's an unusual drink. Today bourbon or scotch is a whole lot more popular. But Canadian whiskey, and here's how it was served. They would serve it in Chinese teacups. Now, why do you think they would do that? Okay, what's it going to look like if it's raided? You could just say, oh no, we're just having tea. Okay, so the cop was on the take, and he basically protected everyone and made sure everyone didn't get too much out of control. Well, just like today, we probably like to go out with our friends places, but at the same time, we also like house parties. Okay, they also had some really extravagant house parties during the 1920s, and the drink of the time was a bit different than in the speakeasies. So the speakeasies had the Canadian whiskey, and the reason why that was popular rather than Scotch was it was a whole lot easier to smuggle in. They would just take it from Canada and bring it over the Detroit River from the Windsor, Canada. Now at the home, in your homes where you would have parties, they had the famous what's called bathtub gin. All right, bathtub gin was basically something, substance you would make in your bathtub with basically any kind of alcohol you could find, even dangerous things like rubbing alcohol. And they would often add something like wintergreen oil. Wintergreen oil, a little bit, is still a little dangerous, but a lot of it's deadly. They would try to make a bathtub full of gin, and the goal was for people to get as drunk as possible, and then flop down there in their apartments, waking up hopefully sometime late afternoon, late afternoon. So there was all this, merriment, and even with the government trying to crack down on illegal production of alcohol. When President Roosevelt in the early 1930s finally, at the height of the Depression, uh, basically made alcohol legal, or had even talked about it, people were chanting, "Beer, beer, we want beer." So, but just because it was illegal did not mean it went away, it just was underground. The 20s was a time of great extravagance in almost all aspects of life. Now, we can see this in the art movements of the time. For example, what replaced the Art Nouveau, Nouveau, the Art Nouveau movement of the 1890s, a French-dominated movement, is going to be the movement with what's called Art Deco. Art Deco is known for very bright colors, very kind of gaudy jewelry, and kind of over the top, extravagant things like rhinestones. So definitely this look at me, notice me kind of jewelry. Now, today people will sometimes have a deco piece. It's just a way of emphasizing, a particular item. So you may have a boring banker's gray flannel suit and a rep tie, but you want to show you have some panache and are interested in style. And what would you do? You would then show some Art Deco cufflinks, or let's say a fountain pen. Some of the most oversized, brightest, gaudiest fountain pens are going to be those of the 1920s, the Deco style. Now, think of the dances of the 20s. One of the famous dances is one named after a beautiful, very gracious American city, and it's called, what do you think it's called? Well, those who said the Charleston, you're right. And the Charleston's a very fast-moving type of dance, and it showed the exuberance of the time. So people definitely celebrating a lot of brass instrumental accompaniment. So fitting in with the theme that we talked about before of the Jazz Age. Now, if you look at design of the time, one thing that really stood out about the 20s is the Tiffany lamps. Now, by the way, when we usually think of Tiffany, we think of the jeweler Tiffany and Company. That is not the one who came up with the Tiffany lamps. The ones who came up with the Tiffany lamps, and the Tiffany lamps are actually very beautiful. They look like stained glass windows you'd see in a beautiful church, but they would be in a lamp for your homes. You get the different colors, and then the bulb would shine on them. Years ago, probably before most of your time, some of the Ruby Tuesdays were decorated that way. Okay, but the Tiffany lamps were named after Louis Comfort Tiffany, the designer, but once again showing the exuberance. Now, the American businessman during the 1920s was seen as a genius, someone who could weave straw into gold, someone who could take something useless and make it something precious. Now, no one understood how they were doing it, but no one cared as long as they were making money. If you're making a lot of money, you're not going to question things. So the American businessman was seen as a genius. So the stock going up and up and up. One thing that led to this inflation of the stock is going to be people could borrow on the margin, which meant you could take the value of your portfolio and then use that as collateral to buy more stock. Since the majority of stock went up, people were becoming wealthier and wealthier. Once again, no one knew how it was being done, but they didn't care as long as they were making money. Okay, people thought this would go on forever, and it seemed for a while that that would be the case. A more recent example, a little bit before your time, living in the 1980s. The 80s, a time a lot of people were making a lot of money, and they felt that this was going to go on forever, but unfortunately it didn't. And that's, one of the things about capitalism. Capitalism is very cyclical. It goes through cycles. There are the boom times, but then there's the bust times. So just when things seem, horrible and that they're never going to get better, well, part of capitalism is it does eventually get better. But the downside is if things are going great, it's not going to stay that way forever. It's instead cyclical, so it's going to go into decline. So that's what's happening, the stock going up and up and up. Then unfortunately, October 29th, 1929. October 29th, 1929, we have our next term, what's called the Great Depression, and also the Great Slump, S-L-U-M-P. Okay, what's a slump? A slump is a rapid decline. So a rapid decline in value. Okay, have any of you played Chutes and Ladders when you were younger? Now remember, it's a fun game. The excitement is you're almost there at the top. You're making fun of those who are behind you, and you feel you're going to win, and then you get your comeuppance. You fall down that huge chute. I think it was at 93 or 94, and then suddenly you're back to almost nothing. And that's what happened to the people who had all this value in their stock. They really did not put anything away for another day. They thought they could live this way forever. Okay, so uh, now in our next lecture, we're going to talk about what makes the stock decline, and also how this is going to affect the people.